The cabin stood as a bastion against the world, a fortress of solitude built from pine logs and disciplined silence. For Jake, it was more than a home. It was a command post in his war against memory. Every morning, the sun rose over the jagged peaks of the Rockies, and every morning, Jake met it with the same rigid ceremony. The cot was made with hospital corners, the floor was swept clean of any dust that dared to settle, and the coffee was brewed with a military precision that left no room for error, no space for thought. He was 45, but his eyes held the ancient weariness of a man who had seen too many suns set on foreign sands. His body, once a finely tuned instrument of the United States Navy SEALs, was still broad-shouldered and capable, but a network of fine scars mapped his history, and a deeper, invisible wound in his soul dictated the rigid stillness of his life. The cold was his constant companion, a physical manifestation of the internal winter that had frozen him solid 2 years ago, the day he buried his wife, Sarah, and 6 months after he'd held his K9 partner, Rex. As the light faded from his loyal eyes in a dust-choked corner of the world, his life was an exercise in containment. Grief was a pressure vessel, and his routine was the hardened steel shell that kept it from exploding. He chopped wood not for warmth, but for the rhythmic, thought-numbing impact of the axe. He ran the mountain trails not for health, but to outpace the ghosts that chased him. Inside the cabin, Sarah's presence was a carefully managed ghost. Her favorite armchair by the hearth remained empty, a silent sentinel draped in the hand-knitted afghan she'd been working on. Her watercolor paintings of wildflowers hung on the walls, vibrant splashes of life in a space otherwise dedicated to muted earth tones and Spartan utility. In the corner, near the door, a worn leather leash and a single, scuffed-up tennis ball lay in a small, empty dog bed. That was Rex's corner. It was a memorial he couldn't bring himself to dismantle, a small, agonizing shrine to a different kind of love, a different kind of loss. He had built his prison well, and he was its only inmate, its only guard. The first flakes of snow began to fall just after noon, fat and lazy, drifting down from a sky the color of slate. Jake watched them from his window, a flicker of something almost like apprehension tightening his jaw. The forecast had promised a dusting, but the air held a heavy, portentous stillness that his training recognized. This was no mere dusting. This was the opening salvo of a siege. He spent the afternoon securing his perimeter, checking the seals on the windows, stacking another cord of wood on the porch, ensuring the generator was fueled and ready. Each task was a familiar drill, a way to channel the rising anxiety into productive, physical action. By dusk, the lazy flakes had become a furious, horizontal onslaught, driven by a wind that shrieked through the pines like a banshee. The world outside his window dissolved into a swirling vortex of white. The power flickered once, twice, then died, plunging the cabin into the warm, dancing shadows of the fire he'd built in the hearth. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the flames and the roar of the storm. He was cut off, alone, just as he wanted. But the storm was relentless, a physical assault that seemed determined to breach his defenses. Sometime deep in the night, a sound, thin and desperate, managed to pierce the howl of the wind. At first he dismissed it, a trick of the gale, a branch scraping against the roof. But it came again, a high, mournful cry that was undeniably alive. It snagged on something deep inside him, a filament of the man he used to be, the protector, the rescuer. He told himself to ignore it. It was not his mission. His mission was survival, his own quiet, insulated survival. But Rex had never ignored a cry in the dark. Sarah would have already been pulling on her boots. The thought was a betrayal to his carefully constructed apathy. The sound came again, weaker this time, almost swallowed by the blizzard's fury. With a curse that was half prayer, half surrender, Jake pulled on his heavy winter gear. The armor of his solitude had been breached, not by a memory, but by a sound. He opened the door and the storm lunged at him like a predator. The wind tore the breath from his lungs and blasted his face with ice crystals that felt like 1,000 tiny needles. Visibility was less than 5 feet, a churning chaos of white and black. He strapped a headlamp to his forehead, its powerful beam cutting a weak, swirling tunnel into the maelstrom. He moved by instinct, his body remembering the muscle memory of navigating treacherous terrain in zero visibility conditions. He followed the sound, a phantom thread pulling him deeper into the woods that bordered his property. He fought through waist-deep drifts, the cold a brutal living thing that clawed at him, seeking any gap in his gear. He found them under the sheltering arms of a massive fallen spruce, a hollowed-out space that offered the barest protection from the storm's wrath. A German shepherd lay on her side, her noble head lifted weakly. Her coat was matted with snow and ice, and one of her back legs was twisted at an unnatural angle, pinned beneath a heavy branch. Her breathing was a shallow, ragged whisper of air, but her eyes, when they met his, were not filled with fear or aggression. They were filled with a profound, intelligent plea. Curled against her belly, shivering violently, were two tiny puppies, their eyes barely open, their whimpers the sound that had summoned him from his fortress. For a long moment, Jake just stood there, the storm raging around him, the beam of his headlamp illuminating the desperate tableau. He saw not just a dying animal, but a mother protecting her young to her last breath. He saw a warrior's spirit in her eyes, a reflection of the same duty that had once burned in his own soul. The ice around his heart, the permafrost of his grief, cracked. It was a hairline fracture, but it was enough. The mission parameters were clear. Preserve life. He knelt, his movements slow and deliberate, letting the mother see his hands. "Easy, girl," he murmured, his voice rough from disuse, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. He unclipped a small trauma kit from his belt, his fingers, despite their numbness, moving with practiced efficiency. He couldn't set the leg here, but he could stabilize it. He used a branch and strips torn from his own thermal undershirt to fashion a crude splint, his touch gentle but firm. The mother whined softly but didn't struggle, as if she understood. She trusted him. That simple, profound act of trust was a weight he hadn't felt in years. Getting them back was an ordeal. He unzipped his heavy parka, the brutal cold instantly sinking its teeth into his chest. He carefully bundled the two trembling puppies inside, zipping them up against his own body heat. They were so small, so fragile, their tiny heartbeats a frantic drumming against his ribs. The mother was the real challenge. She was too weak to walk, too heavy to carry easily. He found a large piece of bark from the fallen tree, and using his paracord bracelet, rigged a makeshift travois. He gently eased her onto it, her amber eyes never leaving his face. The journey back was a brutal, slow-motion battle against the elements. He leaned into the wind, his muscles screaming in protest, his old knee injury flaring into a hot, stabbing pain with every step. He focused on the warmth of the puppies against his chest, on the rhythmic sound of his own labored breathing. He was no longer just a man enduring a storm. He was a rescue operation. He had a purpose beyond the simple, empty act of waking and sleeping. He was bringing life back to his fortress. When he finally stumbled back through the cabin door, he was a creature of ice and exhaustion. He collapsed to his knees, carefully unzipping his jacket to reveal the two puppies, who tumbled out onto the warm rug before the hearth, blinking in the sudden light. He dragged the mother inside on her makeshift sled and kicked the door shut against the raging storm. The silence of the cabin was no longer empty. It was filled with the soft sounds of panting and tiny, questioning whimpers. He had breached his own perimeter, and the world, in all its messy, vulnerable, and demanding glory, had come flooding in. He worked on autopilot, his training taking over where conscious thought failed. He laid one of Sarah's old wool blankets by the fire and gently moved the mother onto it. He examined her leg more closely under the lamplight. It was broken, but the splint would hold until the storm passed and he could get her to a vet. He cleaned the raw, chafed skin on her paws with warm water and antiseptic from his kit. She watched him the entire time, her tail giving a single, weak thump against the floor. The puppies were another matter. They were cold and hungry, their small bodies trembling. He fumbled through his pantry. He had no milk replacer, no supplies for this. He warmed some water and mixed in a tiny amount of powdered milk from his emergency rations, hoping it would be enough. He tried to feed them with a clean syringe he used for oiling his tools, but they turned their heads away, their mouths sealed shut. They huddled together, two distinct personalities already emerging. One, A bold little male, with paws too big for his body, kept trying to stand and explore, only to tumble over in a heap of clumsy limbs. Jake thought of him as Tank. The other, a slightly smaller male, was dark and watchful. He stayed pressed against his mother's side, his dark eyes tracking Jake's every move with a cautious, unnerving intelligence. He was a ghost, and ghost, like his brother, refused to eat. Jake tried again and again, his frustration mounting. He was a SEAL. He had survived impossible situations, navigated complex missions, but he was being defeated by 2 pounds of stubborn fur. He felt a familiar surge of failure, the cold tide that always threatened to pull him under. He wasn't equipped for this. He wasn't a nurturer, he was a soldier, and his war was over. He sank back on his heels, the firelight casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The cabin felt smaller, crowded with this new, fragile life. He looked at the 2 pups, shivering and weak, and saw his own inadequacy reflected in their silent refusal. It was then that the power of his isolation truly hit him. He was completely on his own, with 3 lives depending on him. He scanned his shortwave radio for a signal, the static hissing and crackling, a sound as desolate as he felt. Finally, through a momentary lull in the storm's fury, he caught a faint signal. He managed to reach his closest neighbor, Elira, a woman in her 70s who lived 3 miles down the mountain. She was a widow, her husband gone for a decade, her only son lost in Afghanistan. She understood solitude and loss in a way few could. "I'm on my way," was all she said, her voice calm and steady against the static. An hour later, a figure emerged from the blizzard, solid and unflappable. Ilara was small, but possessed a wiry strength that belied her age. She carried a canvas bag and wore an ancient, oilskin coat, looking more like a seasoned mariner than a mountain recluse. She stepped inside, shaking the snow from her boots, and took in the scene with a single, sweeping glance. Jake, looking lost and helpless. The injured mother, her eyes full of gratitude, and the 2 puppies, huddled and refusing to eat. She didn't offer platitudes or ask unnecessary questions. She simply knelt, her joints cracking, and ran a gentle, knowing hand over the mother dog's head. "Well now," she said softly, her voice like warm honey. "Looks like you've got yourself a family." The word hung in the air, alien and uncomfortable. Family was a ghost in this house. Ilara unpacked her bag, producing a bottle of goat's milk, some old soft towels, and a jar of homemade salve that smelled of pine and herbs. She helped Jake clean and dress the mother's abrasions, her movements economical and sure. But the puppies remained the problem. Even with the warm goat's milk, they refused. Tank nudged the offered bottle with his nose and then turned away, letting out a small, frustrated yelp. Ghost simply retreated further into his mother's fur, a tiny shadow of fear. Ilara watched them, her brow furrowed in thought. She looked from the puppies to Jake, who was sitting stiffly on the floor, his posture as rigid and guarded as ever. "They're scared," she said, her gaze perceptive. "They don't just need food, Jake. They need to feel safe. Their mother trusts you, but they don't know how. You're just a big, loud, strange thing to them." She paused, her eyes softening. "Sometimes the little ones need to see the alpha eat first. They need to know the pack is safe." The words were simple, but they landed with the force of a revelation. The pack. He hadn't been part of a pack since Rex. He hadn't felt like an alpha, a leader, a protector. In 2 years, he had just been a survivor. He looked at the puppies, at their small, vulnerable forms, and a memory surfaced, sharp and clear. He was in a forward operating base, the air thick with sand and the smell of diesel. Rex, then just a pup himself, had been off his food for a day, spooked by the constant percussion of distant artillery. Jake had sat on the floor of their tent, sharing a piece of his MRE beef jerky, letting the young dog sniff his hands, his food, his presence, until the trust was forged, solid and unbreakable. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a protein bar, the emergency ration of a soldier. He unwrapped it and broke off a small piece. The cabin was quiet save for the fire and the wind. He sat on the floor, crossing his legs, making himself smaller, less imposing. He put the piece of the bar in his own mouth and chewed it slowly. Then he held out another tiny crumb on the palm of his hand. He didn't look at the puppies. He just sat there, a silent offering. For a long time, nothing happened. Then he felt a tentative, wet nose touch his fingers. He held his breath. Ghost, the watchful soul, had crept forward. The little puppy sniffed the offering, his dark eyes flicking from Jake's hand to his face, a rapid-fire threat assessment. He licked the crumb, then with a darting motion, took it into his mouth. A moment later, Tank, never one to be left out, came barreling over, tumbling into Jake's lap and gobbling up another piece before Jake could even offer it. A wave of warmth, fierce and unfamiliar, washed over him. It was the first crack of a thaw in his internal winter. He had made himself vulnerable, and in return, he had been given the fragile, priceless gift of trust. He picked up the bottle of warm goat's milk, and this time, when he offered it, Ghost began to nurse. Tank followed suit, pushing his brother out of the way with a clumsy shove. Ilara watched from her chair, a small, knowing smile on her face. "There now," she whispered. "The pack is eating." The storm broke 2 days later, leaving the world transformed, buried under a thick blanket of pristine, silent white. A fragile routine began to form in the cabin, a rhythm dictated not by Jake's solitary discipline, but by the needs of his unexpected guests. He learned the specific pitch of Tank's whine when he was hungry, and the way Ghost would press against his leg for reassurance when a log shifted in the fire. The mother, whom he had started calling Sheba, was healing, her stoic dignity a constant, quiet presence. The sterile order of his home was gone, replaced by the happy chaos of life. A puddle on the floor, a chew toy made from a piece of rope, the faint, sweet scent of puppy milk. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with soft snores and playful yaps. His fortress had become a nursery, a sanctuary. He even found himself talking to them, his voice a low rumble as he told them stories about Rex, about the desert, about missions they had run together. He was speaking the memories aloud, and for the first time, they felt less like ghosts and more like history. On the third day, the sound of an engine broke the profound silence of the mountain. A county animal control truck was making its slow, grinding way up his unplowed driveway. A man in a brown uniform stepped out, his name tag reading, Officer Miller. He was middle-aged with a tired face and the weary posture of a man who had seen too many sad situations. "Got a call about a dog barking during the storm," Miller said, his tone flat and official. "Just doing a welfare check." Jake's entire body went rigid. He stood in the doorway, blocking the view, his stance instinctively protective. The old armor slammed back into place. "Everything's fine," he said, his voice clipped. "Just a stray. I'm handling it." Miller peered over his shoulder, his eyes catching the movement inside. "Sir, I need to see the animal. It's protocol." Reluctantly, Jake stepped aside. Miller's professional demeanor softened slightly as he took in the scene. Sheba resting on her blanket, her splinted legs stretched out, and the two puppies wrestling on the rug. "Well, I'll be," he said softly. "You've got a whole family in here." Then the questions began, a checklist of bureaucracy that grated on Jake's raw nerves. Were there tags, a collar, a microchip? The answer to all was no. "Look, sir, you've done a good thing here," Miller said, pulling out a clipboard. "But the law is the law. Unclaimed strays, especially an injured one with a litter, have to be brought to the county shelter. They'll get proper medical evaluation. We'll hold them for 5 days to see if an owner comes forward." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. The shelter, separation, evaluation. A cold, sterile facility where they would be put in cages, frightened and alone. The image of Ghost's terrified eyes flashed in his mind. "No," Jake said, the word coming out harder than he intended. "They're staying here. They're safe here." Miller sighed, a sound of practiced patience. "I understand how you feel, but I don't have a choice. It's for their own good. We can't just leave them in an unregistered situation." Jake felt a cold rage building, the familiar combat-ready state that preceded a fight. He saw Miller not as a man, but as a threat to his pack. "They are my responsibility," he bit out, the words tasting like iron. Miller looked from Jake's hard, unyielding face to the dog's and seemed to make a calculation. "All right," he said, holding up a hand. "I'll give you 48 hours. You can try to find an owner, or you can get a licensed vet to sign off that moving them would be detrimental to their health. But in 48 hours, I have to come back, and I will have to take them." He left, and the silence he left behind was heavier and colder than the storm had ever been. A ticking clock had been placed on his newfound peace. The threat was no longer the weather or starvation. It was a clipboard and a set of rules. Jake immediately called Alara, who gave him the number for the best veterinarian in the valley, a woman named Anna. He called her, his explanation terse and to the point. He needed a medical justification, a piece of paper to beat the bureaucracy. Dr. Anna promised to be there as soon as she could navigate the snowy roads. She arrived that afternoon, her truck far more capable than Miller's. She was younger than he'd expected, with kind, intelligent eyes and a calm demeanor that immediately put him at ease. She didn't treat his cabin like a crime scene or a curiosity. She treated it like a home. She knelt by Sheba, her touch both professional and gentle, cooing softly to the nervous mother. "You did a good job with this splint," she said, looking up at him with a smile. "Very resourceful." He just grunted in response, unused to praise. Anna examined Sheba thoroughly, then turned her attention to the puppies, laughing as Tank tried to chew on her stethoscope. Her presence filled the cabin with a warmth that was different from the fire's heat, a gentle energy that seemed to soothe everyone, including Jake. "Sheba's leg is a clean break, but it's healing well. Moving her would be stressful, but I'm not sure I could legally classify it as detrimental," Anna said, her expression troubled as she packed her medical bag. "And the pups are healthy, if a bit underweight. Miller is a stickler for the rules, but he's a good man. He's just—" Her words were cut short by a sudden, loud crash from outside. A heavy branch, laden with snow, had finally given way and fallen from a tree near the porch. The sound was like a gunshot. Sheba flinched, Tank yelped and dove under the armchair. But Ghost, the watchful, traumatized soul, reacted instantly. He shot across the room like a black streak and bolted through the cabin door, which was slightly ajar. "Ghost!" Jake yelled, his heart seizing in his chest. He ran to the door and saw the tiny puppy scrambling frantically through the deep snow, disappearing into the dense line of pine trees at the edge of the clearing. A new squall was moving in, the sky darkening ominously, the wind beginning to pick up its mournful song once more. Sheba began to whine, a high, distressed sound, struggling to get to her feet to follow her lost pup. In that moment, everything fell away. The rules, the deadline, Officer Miller, his own carefully guarded pain. All that existed was the image of that small, terrified puppy, alone in the vast, cold wilderness. This was not a mission objective. This was not a choice. He turned to Anna. "Stay with her," he commanded, his voice the calm, authoritative tone of a SEAL team leader. He grabbed his parka and a tracking line and plunged out into the cold without a second thought. The world was a labyrinth of snow and shadow. He picked up the puppy's trail easily, the small paw prints a desperate, panicked line heading into the treacherous back country. The wind howled, whipping snow into his face, but he barely noticed. His senses were on fire, every ounce of his training focused on this one, singular purpose. His bad knee began to throb, a familiar, agonizing beat that he pushed through with sheer force of will. He was no longer the wounded soldier hiding from the world. He was a warrior on the hunt, not for an enemy, but for one of his own. He found him an hour later, backed against the edge of a steep, snow-covered ravine. The little puppy was trembling uncontrollably, his fur spiked with ice, his whimpers lost in the rising wind. The ground around the edge of the ravine was unstable, a cornice of snow waiting to give way. One wrong step, and they would both be lost. "Easy, Ghost," Jake said, his voice low and steady, projecting a calm he did not feel. "I'm here. I've got you." He got down on his stomach, distributing his weight, and began to crawl forward, inch by painful inch. The snow groaned beneath him. He could feel the cold seeping into his bones, the pain in his knee screaming. He kept talking, telling the puppy about Rex, about how brave he was, how he never left a man behind. He was just a few feet away when he heard a voice call his name. He looked back and saw Officer Miller, his face pale with alarm, standing at the tree line. He must have arrived for his deadline and seen what had happened. Behind him stood Anna, her expression a mask of worry. Jake ignored them. He focused on the puppy. "Come on, son. Time to come home," he whispered. He reached out his hand, the same hand that had offered the first piece of food, the first gesture of trust. Ghost looked at his hand, then at his face, and with a final desperate whimper, he took a hesitant step forward. At that exact moment, the snow cornice gave way. Jake felt the world drop out from under him. He reacted instantly, twisting his body, grabbing a thick root exposed at the edge of the ravine with one hand while snatching Ghost's scruff with the other. He dangled there, his arm screaming from the strain, the full weight of his body held by a single desperate grip. The puppy was a terrified, squirming weight in his other hand. Below him was a 50-foot drop onto jagged rocks. He saw Miller running forward, shouting into his radio, saw Anna's hands fly to her mouth. He held on, his muscles burning, his resolve absolute. He would not let this puppy fall. He would not lose another member of his pack. Miller and Anna reached the edge, lying flat, and extended their hands. With a final, desperate heave, Jake swung the puppy up onto solid ground and felt their hands grab his jacket, his arm, pulling him back from the brink. He collapsed onto the snow, gasping for air, clutching the trembling puppy to his chest. Back in the warm, fire-lit cabin, a new kind of silence settled. It was a silence not of absence, but of shared relief. Anna was tending to Jake's knee, which was swollen and bruised. Officer Miller stood by the hearth, staring into the flames, his official hat held in his hands. Ghost was curled in Jake's lap, fast asleep, exhausted but safe. Sheba licked her pup's head occasionally, her tail thumping a soft, steady rhythm against the floor. Finally Miller spoke, his voice quiet. "The official report will state that I found the dogs being cared for in a temporary foster situation, under my authority, pending a full veterinary clearance and formal adoption paperwork." He looked at Jake, his eyes holding a new respect. "I saw a man risk his life for that little guy. That's not a temporary situation. That's family." He placed a stack of forms on the table. "Fill these out. I'll file them myself." He had seen the truth that transcended the rules on his clipboard. He had chosen mercy over protocol. He had become an ally. In the weeks that followed, the mountain began to thaw, and so did Jake. The paperwork was filed. The cabin was no longer a fortress, but a home, loud and messy, and filled with the joy and chaos of two growing puppies and their dignified mother. The found family expanded. Alara visited often, bringing stews and stories. Anna became a regular presence, her gentle warmth a steady light in Jake's life. Even Officer Miller would stop by sometimes, officially to check on his foster case, but really to watch Tank chase his tail in the yard. The ghosts of Sarah and Rex were still there, but they no longer haunted him. Their memories were woven into the fabric of this new life. He found he could look at Sarah's paintings and smile, remembering the joy she took in creating them. He could hold Rex's old leash and feel not a stab of loss, but a surge of gratitude for the years they'd had. He had a new mission. Working with Anna, he started a small, informal network, using his skills to rescue animals stranded or lost in the vast wilderness of the Rockies. He was a rescuer again, his purpose renewed. One evening in late spring, as the setting sun painted the peaks in hues of gold and rose, he sat on his porch. Anna was in the rocker beside him, Ilara in the other. Sheba lay at his feet, her head on his boots. In the yard, Tank, now a lanky, goofy adolescent, tripped over his own paws while chasing a butterfly, rolling head over heels in the new grass. Ghost, sleek and confident, pounced on his brother playfully. For the first time in over 2 years, a sound erupted from Jake's chest that was foreign and yet deeply familiar. It was a laugh, a real deep, unburdened laugh. The women smiled at the sound. After a moment, he reached into the house and came back with a small, worn harmonica. It had been Sarah's favorite. He hadn't touched it since she died. He brought it to his lips and began to play, a simple, sweet melody that drifted out into the twilight. It was a song of sorrow, but also of hope. The music spoke of the long, cold winter and the promise of the spring. His pack was safe. The rescuer had been rescued, and in the quiet warmth of his mountain home, he was finally at peace.